Hello and welcome to Work Reimagined. This is the podcast that explores some of the big questions about how work really works. I'm Lee Ward, and each episode I bring you a guest from the world of work and workplace culture to discuss how work can be reimagined to make it a better experience for everyone. A really fascinating episode this week, and one that got my mind racing and opened up a different way of thinking about a number of different areas within work. Now, this podcast was set up all about introducing different and new ways of thinking that might challenge the norm and improve things at work like performance and experience. And this episode absolutely fits with that. I was introduced to my guest, David Hodges, or the People Geek blogger, by a previous guest, Laura Howard, and it has been great to explore more of his work since then. Today, he's discussing ecological psychology and how understanding this might change the way that we do things at work. We use leadership development as the main example for our conversation, but it could have impacts across lots of different elements that are definitely worth exploring. So possibly the first of a few discussions with David on this podcast, but here's my first chat with him about ecological psychology. David, thank you for joining us on Work Reimagined. I am really looking forward to getting into this conversation since we've been introduced and reading through your work, which we'll talk about. It's been fascinating. So looking forward to getting to the conversation. But before we do that, for our listeners, could you give us a little introduction and what inspires your work?
Yeah, so I am a HR business partner, a practitioner, really in that sort of space. My background really before I was a sort of HR generalist, I was in talent acquisition, both internal and for many years actually externally, which was kind of part of my journey into part of my interest really was during the times when I was recruiting people, I was ended up being more curious around why some people were successful when I placed them, and why some people weren't successful. And for anyone that's worked in recruitment, there's a very nervous few weeks after they start, where you're really hoping they are successful because the holiday that you've booked is dependent on that person being successful. So yeah, that sort of piqued my curiosity really, and I really sort of discovered, I guess, the sort of organizational and individual performance and why people behave in particular ways, and that sort of led me, well, if I kind of want to get into this, kind of need to get into the other side of HR and be a generalist along those lines. So that's what I've been doing. I was very fortunate to do a master's with Ruffy Park in organizational development and people development, and that very much played to my interests in some of the more sort of modern theories around complexity science, chaos theory, and why people behave in particularly bizarre ways. And I would describe myself as probably a sort of academic, or bring a sort of evidence-informed HR. I'm probably not the best person to ask what's the best series going on Netflix at the moment, what's your most favourite film I'm watching, because I often take away academic books on holiday with me, because I just never found a good fiction.
I know when we get into this conversation, I've challenged you with us tackling quite a complex subject in 20, 25 minutes of this episode. We're talking about a different sort of psychology, really, when it comes to the workplace. And this podcast is all around, is there a different way of thinking that might impact the way that you do things in the workplace? And I think what we're going to introduce today absolutely does that. And that is going to be around this term ecological psychology. So taking that challenge, David, could you introduce us to that? And then we can get into the conversation of what that actually means in the workplace.
Yeah, so ecological psychology isn't around trees, along those lines, or why trees act in particular ways. I would describe it probably as a cognitive science. It's fundamentally a methodology of trying to understand how we perceive, see, and act and behave in the world. The fundamental question often in HR we're trying to answer is, why do people behave in a particular way, and how might we encourage them to behave in a particular way, which is often aligned with the organizational goals. So how we see, perceive, and behave in the world is a really, really key core, probably the fundamental question that underpins everything that we do along those lines. So, what ecological psychology does is, from a cognitive science perspective, is it breaks away what I would say is from the dominant assumption. So, first of all, we do not know how people act, perceive, or behave. We have theories and there are models, but fundamentally, at the highest level of intelligence, where people are far more determined and full time working on this around cognitive science, cannot agree how we behave. And there are two broad, let's say, churches, and I'm going to try not to be too evangelical about the ecological side because I don't know whether it is right or not, but it has been helpful for me. Um, One of them is the traditional sort of cognitive science element, and this is seen hugely in pop science, right? So the film we discussed around Inside Out is one example. Terminator is another example. Where you see Terminator walking around, seeing things, reading things, and calculating things. Things like The Matrix is a great example where they plug the main character into a computer and they upload karate into that particular individual. And all of these traditional side, let's call it that, is really based on the premises that the brain is a computer and the computer is like a brain. It's this entwined relationship that grew out of the post-war era where psychology really kicked off. And also so did computer science. And this whole idea of the brain as a computer, the computer as a brain is a nice analogy, but it's been taken so far beyond an analogy, it's almost the scientific basis for how we A, do understand humans, and B, how we try and design computers. Um, During that same time, there was another approach, which was more, I guess, around where ecological psychology sort of came out of. And there are a number of key people in this field. So anyone that studied OD will understand the Lewin equation of behavior is a function of person and environment. And the P and the E are in brackets because they are intertwined. So Lewin kind of came up with this equation, which is beautiful, up there with E equals MC squared, but sadly just not as well marketed. And this equation got sort of forgotten, and the psychology and the global sort of defense world, let's be honest, that spent huge amounts of money on artificial intelligence and psychology kind of took that over. So following Lewin, there was a number of people, and two people by the name of Gibson popped up, both Eleanor and Jay Gibson. And they very much sort of started to understand the limitations of this approach, and fundamentally coined over a number of years what is now ecological psychology. Some people may understand the term 4E cognition, which effectively this is where sort of cognitive psychology is going, which is that cognition is both embodied, i.e., cognition is not just the brain. In the same way your lung isn't your respiratory system, your brain isn't your cognition system. It's greater and more than that. So you have what you call embodied cognition. And this is that, we hear this a lot, of the gut feeling. Oh, that made my hair stand up on my neck. This is your body cognizing, interpreting, and understanding the environment more than just that brain giving you some thoughts. The other piece of the E is the embedded. So in the fact that, and this is where the ecological psychology really starts to come, is that cognition is embedded in the environment. Following on from a guy called Newell, I sort of coined the term, something always happens somewhere by someone. And what this means is that cognition doesn't just happen within the brain. You can't take a person out of the environment, the physical environment, and the time where they are, and expect cognition to happen. Cognition is situated and is embedded in the environment. There is then the extended side, which is the third E, and that is things like computers, right? We use computers, we use pens and paper, we use calculators. All of these things are extensions of cognition. So we can't say purely that cognition happens in the brain. And then the final one is enacted. And this is the action and perception are directly coupled. A great example of this is pigeons. So whenever you see a pigeon walking, you notice their heads bob. Again, popular myth is that is because their spine or a mechanical reason why their heads bob. But if you put a pigeon on a treadmill, its head doesn't bob. It's the most oddest thing. Look it up. You can go online. You can see pigeon on treadmill. Its head does not bob. And that's because it uses the head bobbing as a way of perceiving distance. So again, action is directly coupled towards perception, and that perception directly guides action. So as they don't need to perceive depth because the environment isn't moving towards them, they don't need to bob their head. So we're seeing over the last 20 years cognition and how we behave moving to more of this embedded element. Ecological psychology is kind of one of the key tenets that starts to actually give us a science behind why and what and how this happens beyond this analogy of the brain being a computer.
Just that simplicity of that three S's that you talked about there. So someone, somewhere doing something is a real kind of check and challenge for us, isn't it? In the space of supporting people and trying to either influence behavior change or helping people to develop. Just making sure that we're considering all three of those elements, and it links back to previous episodes we've talked about where we've often gone to the someone and focused on how can we influence the someone in terms of fixing that someone, ignoring the something that they're looking to do or the somewhere that they're looking to do it. That prominence of cognitive psychology, though, what has it led us to do in the workplace in terms of learning and development and those workplace initiatives?
So first of all, I guess the cognitive psychology, if you ask a HR practitioner, what cognitive science is your practice based on? Oh, it's not based on any science. Well, it is, whether it's consciously or unconsciously along those lines. And most likely it's based on cognitive science, right? A great example is Inside Out. That is a really good evidence, a great film, by the way, and really good entertainment. It's perceived to be true, right? Nobody, I wonder, I ask how many, psychologists looked to that film and said, well, if the character is being controlled by joy, the character in their head pressing all the buttons, who's controlling joy? You're constantly kicking intelligence down a level. For that to happen, you have to have someone controlling joy. So Joy's got someone in her head, but then someone has to be in her head, and someone has to be in her head. So you end up with this sort of never-ending description of actually where does cognition happen. So that's kind of one of the problems. And what we end up doing a lot in learning is saying, well, I've told them. I've given them a verbal set of words and meanings, and I've put that in their ears. Gone in through one ear, out the other is a great analogy, again, for the belief that you can access the brain and cognition through a verbal wording, goes in the brain, it's stored in long-term memory for someone to sort of recall it, and then they go away and do it. So you often hear, oh, but we sent them the email, we told them, or they've been on training, they can verbally recite the policy, they know what they should be doing, but we know what they're actually doing is incorrect. And then we kind of go, oh, well, it hasn't worked. And what do we do? And ecological psychology gives us this thing called affordances. And it's a beautiful term in the way that the environment, and I can include the environment both in the time and the physical space, affords me certain things. So a great example, let's use sport, for instance, because you won't see on camera, but I'm not the tallest of people in the world. So let's take me in a basketball court, and let's take someone who is taller than me, like 6'3" in a basketball court. Physically, we are in the same place, right? We are both in the same time, same place. But the basketball hoop affords someone who's tall slam dunking it. Okay, so that affordance, that ability to do something, that behavior that comes out of it is a combination of someone, which is the person, and the change there is the height. The something, which is scoring some points in basketball, and the somewhere is both the physical location and the time, right? Because if you're right near the end and you've only got 1 second go, you don't have time to dribble and slam. So time equally as a constraint, and that's another ecological term, but is a factor of the environment, the same way my height is a constraint. So those are the factors of the environment, and those create affordances. So because I'm shorter, I might go for a throw. Apologies to any basketball players, I'm totally monitoring your sport here. Whereas someone who's taller will go for a slam dunk. And effectively, that starts to describe why someone might do those two things. And when I say it in that way, it sounds really obvious, right? Well, yeah, absolutely. The behavior is a function of both person, environment, time, and the task to be done. But when we come to then work, we very much focus on the person. So if I look at all the way we train people, especially e-learning, it's all about giving people knowledge about the subject, not knowledge of the subject. I can read an employee relations book. I can swallow the entire CIPD manual, but you wouldn't necessarily want me then handling a complex employee relations case. Again, I can recite all the knowledge, but it doesn't transfer into behavior. And again, comes from this belief that, if we program the brain with all this knowledge, that then tells the body through action what to do. Whereas ecological psychology very much leans towards, especially when we look at learning, what we call experiential learning, which again isn't a new thing, right? And really, I think it died because e-learning has suddenly come about and it's suddenly a lot cheaper. And we can say, but we've trained them, we've got completion rates. So experiential learning kind of just died away, but actually I'm kind of going, well, actually we should be doing more of this. And they go, it's really expensive. But the science, if we look at how we perceive now in the sort of competition space, really does show that the only way to effectively learn is through experiential learning. If we actually measure the effectiveness of our training, what the environment affords someone starts to give us a methodology to actually understand behavior. So if you took handling a poor performing individual, a great leader, as someone who is highly experienced and successful at it, is attuned, and I say attuned, they are perceiving the affordances in the environment. So I might say if I was coaching someone through difficult conversations, I've given them a module on active listening. So I can describe to you what active listening is. But actually an expert, they might say, oh yeah, I do active listening, but I wouldn't call it that. What I'm doing is I'm attuning to the person's facial expressions, their voice tone, and I'm waiting for a particular moment which invites me to speak. So again, the cognition is much more embedded in the environment.
And you talked about some of the practical impact of that, then the practical application of that, David, in the workplace. You talked about performance management within there. What does this practically mean then? So if somebody, I've got a sense from your introduction to ecological psychology, I can see the history of where cognitive psychology has impacted the way that I work or the way that I lead teams. But if we're now taking a more of a ecological psychology approach, what impact does that have within the workplace? So if we took something like developing leaders, since we've spoken, I can absolutely see where we pick up a group of leaders, put them in a different environment, impart the knowledge and the theories and the models, and put them back in their environment of them leading their teams. So what would that look like? What would effective leadership development look like from an ecological psychology perspective?
Yeah, and a lot of those that sort of went through the experiential leadership side will be shouting at the screen going, this is what I'm talking about, right? And I think part of the challenge is, to a certain extent, is that we haven't had a scientific principle to understand why experiential learning is important. And that is because we very much relied on this cognitive approach of that if I give them the information, it doesn't matter where I give it to them. If I teach them empathetic listening in a room in the middle of nowhere, and maybe we do some role plays with each other, then they know it. When I place them back in the environment, again, they are a computer, I've programmed them. Whether we explicitly say there's not, if you ask someone, well, why does that work? They will give you that sort of cognitive psychology approach. So if we can say, actually, we know that isn't effective, the skill is around teaching individuals to attune, i.e. to focus on the affordances in the environment, that is the important bit. And the difference between expertise and novices is often actually they attune to less information. Mary Earp's in the penalty spot, waiting to try and understand which way a penalty goes. An expert will look at a very small number of things. So Mary Earps might be looking at the lift of the leg, the hip replacement on that sort of side, or the angle of the shoulder. She doesn't know that. She's not saying these are things. This is why we talk about subconscious, right? But actually, she's directly perceiving the correct affordances. And we know this from driving. When you first start driving, a roundabout is a massive thing, right? So we talk about then cognitive overload. The brain can't process it quick enough. Whereas actually, an expert just looks at the angle of the wheel, can look at the eye gaze of the person driving the car where they're looking. Anyway, going back to where does leadership? So you first of all got to identify the information environment which is most useful for using your behavior against. And then you start to teach them through those particular things. What are the affordances in the environment? And then, if you look at organizational development, anyone that read the book Nudge Theory, some of that science is underpinned and explained by a more ecological view. That where I place something on a shelf invites your behavior. So you start to look at what I would start to say is don't focus on what is in their heads as much. Focus what their heads are in. Mindsets are a great example of this. This is a lovely word that has obviously been hugely popularized recently, but it kind of makes me itch a bit when we talk about mindsets. Because again, we're focused on the problem being in the head. It's that person needs to change their mindset. Whereas actually their mindset is often an emergent property of their history, their experiences, and the environment they're in right now.
So within that experiential learning, we're very much talking about being with them in the environment, not like you said, getting them into a room and teaching them those theories and those models and what it means, but actually being in there and talking to them about what they're attuning to and what kind of cues they're picking up on. And I know from reading through your blogs, you talk about really studying what you might class as expert leaders within your organization and starting to understand what is it that they're attuning to that might be different to what a novice first-time manager might be attuning to, and how you bridge that gap. Would that be something that could be factored into that leadership development, as well as how do we support these managers that are come in, current managers, aspiring managers? What is it that our best leaders are doing in the organization, and how can we learn from that?
Yeah, so if you look at often we'll do this, we'll recruit leaders, and the first thing on the job description will be an academic thing or a years of experience type measure. And actually, we've known for years and years and years, neither of these things are hugely predictive of performance. Yet, if you started to actually start to ask a great leader in these particular scenarios, first of all, so what are the scenarios where this leader is excellent? What are you attuning to? What are you seeing? What are you coupling your actions to? So, in a difficult stakeholder conversation, what are you perceiving, looking at, and attuning to? And starting to capture these bits in a job, either we call it a job description or the knowledge, skills, and attitudes of a particular person. And then you start to go, okay, well, how do I start to replicate these scenarios?
Yeah.
And I think this is where AI and VR is a real big game changer in the learning and development and the general training industry for us, because actually learning is a trade-off always between repetitiveness and representativeness. Let's say you were repeating having a performance conversation with a poor performing colleague. You've got to have a lot of poor performing people in real life to make it really representative. But you can make it really repetitive by merely just practicing a script, saying it in front of a mirror. So, okay, so that's repetitive, but not very representative. We know for learning to transfer, it has to be representative. And again, ecological psychology underpins that from a science, because you're attuning to specifying information in the environment that's real. So AI with, these things now, you can start to program personas into people, and you can start to have more representative but still highly repetitive conversations. I work for a company that builds flight simulators. We've done this for years with pilots, is that we've taken them out of the air. We do a little bit of classroom, right? They understand the coefficient of drag, but that doesn't help them land an aircraft. And then we put them in a simulator and we do highly representative learning environments at a high level of repetition. So I think AI is a really big, and VR, and there's firms doing this now, are a great opportunity for us to start to coach leaders in those core elements of what makes a great leader. It might be difficult conversations with stakeholders, or if it's managers handling poor performance. You can capture what someone does really, really well, program that into an AI, then you have mentors in the same way you have someone in the pilot sort of going, did you notice your dial dropped down there? Or did you notice the slight vibrations coming through for the stick? That's a pre-stall. And you see, again, really experienced people like firefighters is a great example, where they'll say, why did you do that? How did you know that fire was on the bottom floor? And they'll go, I didn't. I just felt it. I just knew what to do. So this is where AI and VR allows us to very much take that highly representative learning environment where we can directly attune leaders and managers to the specifying information around the particular piece you want to do and repeat it highly, 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 even to a point where, if you've got a difficult conversation coming up, let's say at 9:30 a.m. I've got to have this really difficult performance management conversation with someone. At 8:30 a.m., here's an AI, here's a program which matches their persona. This is how the person behaves. Just have a 20-minute practice and remember what we spoke about. And there's a bit of feedback in the AI because it can understand what you're doing. So it's like a little coach that happens beforehand. And that's that just-in-time learning. And all of this can be a big thing as well. That costs a lot of money for an AI. I can do an e-learning course around having a difficult conversation for a tenth of the price. But there's no evidence to support that e-learning is effective. So you're just wasting money. Whereas actually, if you spend twice the amount, you might have 10 times the level of effectiveness. Whatever I'm doing from a HR practice point of view, is it thinking about the something, someone, somewhere?
And as often as the case with these conversations, I could carry on this conversation because I think there's so much more to this. We've touched on one element there with leadership development, but there's a whole heap of other things. So I feel there might be a second episode here, David, to come back and explore some of those. But it has been fascinating. I really appreciate it. And we are going to go on to quick fire questions in a minute to finish us off as usual. But before we do, what's the best way of people kind of connecting with you, learning a bit more about this and understanding more?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm on LinkedIn, obvious one. I've had a numerous conversations with different people as I've started to talk about this. Yeah, feel free there. And then if you're geeky like me, I have my People Geek blog where I try and explore some of these subject areas through the written format along those lines. So yeah, and I try to make it accessible. I think it's fairly accessible, but without equally, making it sort of totally fictional. So there is some reference points in there if you want to go really deep. It's a sort of pracademic writing, I guess is what I would call it.
And
I'm not selling it, am I?
having read a number of those blogs in preparation for our conversation, I can absolutely agree about it being accessible, and I would much for it being very thought-provoking as well in terms of where it makes your mind go in terms of some of this thinking. So our closing questions, and you probably referenced answers to some of these throughout our conversation as well, but our first one, if you could change one thing about workplace culture, what would that be and why?
I would shift from the what's thinking about what's in their head to what's their head in. That would be
Nice.
the direction of travel, away from focusing purely on the person as the mediator and the center of behavior, to the environment and the person. Behavior is a function of person and environment. Back to Lewin's tidy equation.
And like we said, lots of references to previous conversations that we've had on this podcast. I think a consistent message about not neglecting the environment that somebody is doing an act within. If there's one myth about leadership that you think needs reimagining, what would that myth be?
I think that leadership is natural, or that it's universal. You read these books about the great leaders of the time. I can imagine anyone that read the Elon Musk one's probably dated a little bit quickly now, but it's a great example that leadership is situational. It's embedded and enacted in a particular environment. So yeah, try and remove and take away from sort of copy and paste great leadership. What is great leadership in that situation at that time, and getting to that, as opposed to these universal sort of leadership competency frameworks which are applied everywhere.
And you've referenced sport quite a number of times in this conversation. You can absolutely see that, can't you, of a successful manager in one team going into another team, and for some reason it just doesn't work in that environment. So definitely can reflect on that. And finish us off, if there's one word that you think is key to a thriving workplace, what would that one word be?
Affordances.
Brilliant. And another great takeaway. David, thank you. Like we said, I'm sure we could continue this conversation. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Fascinating conversation, and thanks to David for giving up his time. If you're interested in finding out more, you can check out his People Geek blog and connect with him on LinkedIn, and there are links for both of these in the episode description. I'd love to hear the thoughts that this episode might have sparked in the comments, and as always, it would be great if you could spend a few minutes to rate and subscribe to the show and share with anyone you think might be interested. As always, thanks for listening or watching, and see you next time on Work Reimagined.